I didn't understand it then the way the room can feel completely normal 1 second and completely wrong the next. One moment you're passing the potatoes, and the next, you're not sure you know the person sitting across from you. My breath caught before my brain even processed what I'd heard. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary. Gray sky pressing against the kitchen windows. November rain streaking down the glass like long, quiet fingers. My mother-in-law, Margaret, had come for dinner. She did that every other week, a ritual I'd accepted years ago as part of being married to her son. I'd set the table with the blue dishes, lit a single candle that flickered between us. My husband, David, sat at the head of the table, carving the roast chicken I'd spent too long preparing. I'm Claire. I'm 37, and I've been married for 11 years. That sounds simple, doesn't it? 11 years. Like a neat little package tied with twine. But marriage isn't neat. Marriage is 1,000 small silences. 1,000 things you mean to say but don't. 1,000 things your husband means to tell you but somehow forgets. Or chooses not to. Before that night, I would have described my life as stable, quiet, even. David and I met when I was 25, fresh out of a relationship that had left me hollow and hesitant. He was steady, reliable. He remembered how I took my coffee. He never raised his voice. When he proposed, I told myself that safety was enough, that love didn't always have to feel like a storm. And for 11 years, I believed that. We lived in a small house on a tree-lined street, the kind of house where neighbors wave and children's bicycles lie abandoned on front lawns. I worked as a librarian, a job that suited my love for silence and order. David was an architect. He drew beautiful, precise lines for a living, and I suppose, in his own way, he drew them around our marriage too. Everything in its place. Everything controlled. Margaret was the only chaos that entered our home. She was sharp-tongued and forgetful in that charming way older women sometimes are. She'd show up with mismatched earrings and a story about losing her car in the grocery store parking lot for an hour. David adored her. I did too, mostly. But there was always something about the way she looked at him, a flicker of worry, a shadow behind her smile that I couldn't name. That Tuesday, she arrived early. The rain had matted her silver hair, and she was laughing at herself as she shook out her umbrella on the porch. I handed her a glass of wine, and she settled into her usual chair by the window. "You look tired, Claire," she said. Not unkindly, just observant. I smiled. "It's the weather." "It's David," she said, half under her breath. I didn't respond to that. I'd learned years ago not to feed her commentary on her son. Margaret loved him fiercely, but she also saw him clearly, sometimes too clearly. David came downstairs 10 minutes later, his hair still damp from the shower. He kissed his mother's cheek, squeezed my shoulder, the same gesture he'd made 1,000 times, and asked what was for dinner. Something shifted inside me that night. I just didn't know it yet. We ate slowly. The rain picked up, drumming against the roof. The candle between us had burned low, wax pooling at the base like melted snow. David talked about a new project at work, a commercial building downtown, all glass and sharp angles. Margaret nodded along, but her mind seemed elsewhere. She kept glancing at an old photograph on the sideboard, one I'd never paid much attention to. A family photo, David as a boy, maybe 12, standing between his parents in front of a blue car. "You were such a serious child," Margaret said, interrupting David mid-sentence. He stopped, fork halfway to his mouth. "Mom." "What?" "You were." She turned to me. He never smiled in pictures. Even when we took him to the beach, that trip to Cape Cod, remember David? He just stood there with his arms crossed. David set his fork down. I saw his jaw tighten just a fraction, a tell I'd learned to read over the years. Everyone's serious at 12, he said. No, Margaret said, and her voice softened in a way that made me look up. Not everyone. You changed after well. The silence fell like a stone dropped into deep water. I looked between them, my fork still in my hand, the chicken growing cold on my plate. After what? David shook his head. It's nothing. Old family stuff. Margaret blinked, and I saw at the moment she realized she'd said too much. Her hand went to her wineglass, but she didn't drink. She just held it, her knuckles pale. Margaret, I pressed. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Or the quiet detective that lives inside every woman who's ever felt like she's missing half the story. She looked at David. He gave her a small, tight nod. Permission, or surrender. It was before you, dear, Margaret said slowly. When David was in college, there was a girl. My heart didn't race. It just stopped. Then started again, too fast. I didn't ask the obvious question. I didn't say, what girl? Because I already knew, in the way you know a storm is coming before you see the lightning. This wasn't an ex-girlfriend story. This was something heavier. Her name was Alina, Margaret continued, her voice almost a whisper now. The rain seemed to grow louder, as if trying to drown her out. They were together for 2 years. David was going to marry her. I turned to my husband. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the photograph on the sideboard, the boy with the serious face, standing in front of the blue car. I never told you, David said quietly, because it didn't matter anymore. That's when something changed. I should have stopped. I should have let it go. 11 years of marriage, and he'd never mentioned another woman he'd almost married. That should have been a conversation for another time. A private time. Not in front of his mother, with rain hammering the windows and the candle sputtering out. But Margaret wasn't finished. She died, Claire, she said. And her voice broke on the word died like it was still fresh, even after all these years. A car accident. 6 months before the wedding. David found out while he was studying for finals. He didn't come home for the funeral. He just stopped talking about her, completely, like she'd never existed. The room tilted. I looked at David, really looked at him, the way his shoulders had curved inward, the way his hands rested flat on the table, palms down, as if he were holding himself in place. I'd seen that posture 100 times when we fought, when I cried, when the dog died, when I told him my father was sick. I'd always interpreted it as calm, control. Now I understood. It was the posture of a man who had learned, 20 years ago, that the world could shatter without warning, and who had been bracing himself ever since. Why didn't you tell me? My voice came out quieter than I intended. Not angry, just hollow. David finally looked at me. His eyes were the same gray as the sky outside. Because I didn't want you to think you were second. I shouldn't feel this. But I did. A cold, creeping thing climbing up my spine. Not jealousy, how could I be jealous of a dead woman? Not betrayal, not exactly. It was something more complicated. Something ugly. He'd hidden her. Erased her. For 11 years, I'd shared a bed with a man who carried an entire chapter of his life I knew nothing about. And worse, I understood why. That was the part that scared me. Because I looked at him, and I didn't see a liar. I saw a 20-year-old boy who'd lost the future he'd planned. Who'd buried his grief so deep that even he couldn't find it anymore. Who'd built a new life with me, a safe, quiet, orderly life, and told himself that was enough. Tell me honestly, would you have done the same? Margaret excused herself to the bathroom. The click of her heels on the hardwood floor echoed like a countdown. When she was gone, David reached across the table and took my hand. His palm was warm, familiar. I knew the calluses on his fingers from years of drafting. I knew the way his thumb would trace small circles on my skin when he was nervous. Claire, he said, I was going to tell you. I didn't know how. You had 11 years, I whispered. I know. Did you love her? The question came out before I could stop it, and I regretted it immediately, because I saw the answer in his face before he spoke. Yes, he said, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. It's not the same. You're not a replacement, Claire. You're my wife. Was I? I'd spent 11 years believing I knew every corner of him, every scar, every secret, every silence. And now I understood that the man I'd married had been shaped by a loss so profound that he'd learned to disappear inside himself. The silence felt too heavy. I pulled my hand back. Not cruelly, just I needed air. I needed to think. I stood up and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cold glass. Rainwater slid down the other side like tears I couldn't cry. I'm not angry, I said. And I meant it. Almost. Then what are you? I turned to face him. I'm wondering what else you haven't told me. That's when the twist came. Not a dramatic one. Not a villain's monologue or a hidden letter. Just a small, devastating truth that Margaret delivered when she returned from the bathroom, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. I kept her picture, Margaret said softly, in my nightstand. David doesn't know. I couldn't bear to throw it away. She was going to be my daughter-in-law, Claire. I loved her too. David stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. Mom, stop. But Margaret wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not apology. Ho. He never told you because he thought it would hurt you, she said. But the real reason, Claire, the real reason he never mentioned her is because he's still scared. Not of losing you, of loving you too much and losing you the same way. I should have stopped. But I didn't. I walked across the kitchen and knelt beside David's chair. I took his face in my hands, the stubble on his jaw, the fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we married. He was crying, quietly, the way he cried at funerals and the ends of sad movies, tears that didn't make a sound. I'm not Alina, I said. I know. I'm not going to disappear. He closed his eyes. You don't know that. No one knows that. But you don't get to protect me from life, David. That's not how marriage works. Margaret left early that night. She kissed my cheek, a long, lingering kiss, the kind mothers give when they're asking for forgiveness, and slipped out into the rain. The door clicked shut, and suddenly the house was too quiet. David and I stood in the kitchen for a long time. The dishes sat unwashed in the sink. The candle had burned out completely. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. Tell me about her, I said. He hesitated. I saw the war inside him, the urge to protect, to deflect, to hide. And then, slowly, he exhaled. She laughed too loud, he said. In movie theaters, she'd get shushed constantly. And she loved yellow. Wore it all the time, even though it washed her out. I told her that once, and she threw a pillow at my head. I listened. For 2 hours, I listened. He told me about Chinese letter cooking, about the road trip they'd planned but never took, about the song that played on the radio the day he got the phone call. He told me things he'd never told anyone, not his mother, not his friends, not the therapist he saw briefly in his 20s. And when he finished, I didn't feel jealous anymore. I felt something closer to grief. Not for her, for him. For the 20 years he'd spent carrying this alone, convinced that silence was the same as strength. Was I wrong or just human? I don't know if trust can survive hidden history. I don't know if love is strong enough to absorb the weight of a past we weren't part of. What I know is that I stayed. That night, I took his hand and led him upstairs. We lay in the dark, listening to the rain, and I let him hold me the way he probably wanted to hold her tightly, desperately, like I might slip through his fingers. Some secrets, I've learned, aren't lies. They're wounds. And you don't heal a wound by pretending it isn't there. You clean it. You tend to it. You let it breathe. We're still married. A year has passed since that dinner. David still doesn't talk about Alina often, but when he does, he doesn't look away anymore. And I've stopped searching for other secrets in the cracks of our marriage. Not because I'm sure there aren't any, but because I've realized that loving someone means accepting that you'll never know them completely. That's not failure. That's intimacy. The photograph of Alina is in our bedroom now. David's mother gave it to me. A small black and white of a dark-haired girl laughing at something off camera. I look at it sometimes, when I'm alone, and I say a quiet thank you. Not for losing her, for the fact that her loss taught my husband how to hold on. If you've ever discovered something about someone you love that made you question everything, subscribe to this channel, because we're just getting started. And I promise you, the stories we carry are never as simple as they seem. Tell me in the comments, would you want to know your partner's deepest wound, or would you rather believe the silence was kindness?